Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We will get started just a minute or two after 1 o'clock. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to our webinar, Exposed to Fraud, What Separates Victims from Non-Victims. This webinar is brought to you in partnership with the FINRA Investor Education Foundation. My name is Laura Cook, and I am the Director of Training and Technical Assistance with the National Center for Victims of Crime. Before we get started, I'm going to provide a bit of information about using Zoom. At the bottom of your screen towards the middle, you'll see a Q&A box. Please type any questions for the presenter there. We'll answer questions towards the end of the presentation. A little bit towards the left or towards the right, but still in the middle, you'll see a chat box icon. If you have any technical issues or questions not intended for the presenter, you can type those there in the chat box. We will be recording the webinar and we'll send out a link to the recording to everyone later this week. So next, I'd like to briefly introduce our presenter, Gary Matola. Mr. Matola is the Research Director for the FINRA Investor Education Foundation and a social psychologist with over 25 years of research experience. In his role at the FINRA Foundation, he oversees and conducts research projects aimed at better understanding financial capability in America, protecting investors from financial fraud, and improving financial disclosure statements. Dr. Matola received his BA from the University at Albany, MA from Brooklyn College, and PhD from the University of Delaware. He was a visiting scholar at Wharton in 2006 and is an adjunct professor of statistics in Villanova University's MBA program. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Matola, to tell us more about victims and non-victims of financial fraud. And you might need to unmute yourself. Everybody has been muted for now.
I am unmuted, but hold on.
There you go. I can hear you now.
Okay. Am I in now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for that nice introduction. And good afternoon, everybody, if you're on the East Coast, and maybe good morning if you're a little further west. It's really nice to be here today to talk about this important topic with you all, and looking forward to sharing some data with you and also getting your thoughts and your questions as well. As you can see from this first slide, this research project was very much a collaboration between the Institute for Marketplace Trust, the FINRA Investor Education Foundation, and the Stanford Center on Longevity. And I won't go into the detail about all the authors on this research piece, but you can see them all here. They come from those three institutions that I just discussed. Plus, I will point out Emma Fletcher. She is with the Federal Trade Commission, and she is an author on this paper as well. Just for government reasons, we couldn't use the logo for the FTC, but she is very much part of this project. So in reality, there's really 4 organizations that contributed to this research. So in every sense, it took a village to produce this. And the only other point I'll make about these researchers on this page is that they each bring kind of a unique set of skills and experiences to the project that was of great help. So I want to talk a little bit about the Better Business Bureau's Scam Tracker database, because that was the source for the data that we used for this project. Some of you may be familiar with the Scam Tracker database, but it's a fairly new tool. Kind of started to come online in late 2016, early 2017, and it's a crowdsourced database where people can enter frauds, whether they were victimized or not. They could say, hey, somebody approached me about a fraud. They could enter the type of fraud. They can indicate if they ultimately were victimized. They could provide how much money they lost, et cetera. And it's also a searchable database. So if somebody approaches you and you think it's fraud, you can come to this database and say, hey, has anybody else been reporting this? And you can drill down on geography. So it's a really, really valuable tool. And as you can see here, it's widely used. New scam reported every 10 minutes. So there's an awful lot of data in this database. A little bit more on Scam Tracker and how it led to this research study. So, again, probably back in late 2016, the FINRA Foundation was talking with some colleagues we know at the Better Business Bureau, and they were telling us about this database. And we realized immediately the potential power of using Scam Tracker data for research. And here's why. So we're not the first people. The title of this is Exposed to Scams, and the subtitle is What Separates Victims from Non-Victims. And I can tell you, we're not the first researchers who tried to figure out how victims and non-victims differ. But there was a lot of great research that came before, but one significant limitation of the early research was that the researchers couldn't tell who had been approached or contacted for fraud. So in other words, they could tell who the victims were, and they could identify who the non-victims were, but the non-victims might not have been victimized because they were never targeted for fraud. So it wasn't necessarily an apples-to-apples comparison. You knew the victims were all targeted for fraud. Some of the non-victims might have been targeted. Some of the non-victims might not have been targeted. So you couldn't really get a clear picture when you compared victims and non-victims. Immediately, we knew the Scam Tracker database could help us get around that limitation, because everybody who reported into the Scam Tracker database was targeted for fraud. Some of them became victims, others did not. But this gave us a much cleaner comparison in terms of comparing victims to non-victims. So we were excited when we heard about this database, and the research project's been a long time in the making, but it's nice to be able to share some of the information with you today. So let's talk a little bit about the methodology before we get into it, because the methodology is important. So this is what we call a mixed methods research project. So basically it's 2 stages. The first stage is what's called the qualitative phase, where you do, in our instance, we did in-depth interviews with victims and non-victims. Again, we got their contact information from the Scam Tracker database, said, hey, would you sit in for an in-depth interview about the scam you reported? And again, we had a number of victims and non-victims say, sure, I'm happy to talk to you about it. And when I say in-depth interviews, these were really, really in-depth interviews. They were about an hour in length. Most of them took place at the person's house. In other words, our researcher went out to the person's house because we basically took an ethnographic approach where we really wanted to find out everything about the victims, where they lived, kind of what their environment looked like, so that we could really understand the victimization process. And so these were in-depth interviews. They were all filmed. We do have a lot of footage of the victims and non-victims, but unfortunately, I can't share it on the webinar today. But we will be making some of that footage public in the near future. So from this qualitative phase where we did this interviewing, we had a number of research questions, and we built a survey based on these interviews. And the survey was about 15 minutes long, and as you can see here, we got over 1,400 responses, which is a pretty good sample size. And the data was fielded in August of 2018. I know that seems like a long time ago, but research can take a long time. It can be a slow-moving train. So we only released this data in October. So this is a pretty fresh October of this year. So this is a pretty fresh research study. The only other point I'll make is that so financial fraud or fraud. You use the term fraud or financial fraud. It's a very it covers a lot of space. So there's a lot of different types of frauds. We basically looked at 13 different types of fraud in this study. The most common ones were tech support and tax collection. Online purchases was another big one, employment fraud, but there were other ones that were less common. But the bottom line is this covers a broad array of frauds that were perpetrated against the victims and essentially the non-victims were targeted for. Okay. So let's dive into the data. So when we began analyzing the data, the first thing that jumped out at us was, well, there are really 3 segments or 3 groups, and you could see them here. Almost half, 47%, did not engage with the fraudster at all. And that means if the phone rang, they hung up on them. If they got an email, they did not return the email. If they got a direct mail piece, an actual physical document, they did not call or go to a website. They didn't do anything. They just simply did not engage with the fraudster. And we thought this was well, we were kind of torn on this. We thought this was great. We're like, wow, half the people didn't engage at all. But then at the same time, the other side of that coin was half or over half did engage, and you could see that in this pie chart as well. 30% engaged with the fraudster in some fashion, and did not become victimized. So at some point along in the process, they realized, well, this probably isn't a legitimate offer, and pulled out. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why they pulled out as we get a little deeper into the presentation. But then we had this group, 23% of the overall population, who engaged with the fraudster and ultimately became victimized. And essentially, we define victimized by they lost money. Now it's interesting. There was a small group of people who said they lost money, and then on additional questions, we said, well, did you get all of it or any of it back? And they said yes. So we did not put them in the victim category. And I will say that defining what is a fraudulent event can actually be pretty difficult. We've been doing this research for a while now, and sometimes people think it's fraud and it's not fraud. One of the classic examples I have is what we were doing interviewing, actual kind of in-person interview with somebody, and we said, have you ever been victimized by fraud? And he said yes. And And when we asked, okay, what exactly happened, the person seriously said, I bought a piece of pizza, but there wasn't enough cheese on it. So these are the type of things, we call that a negative financial experience as opposed to fraud. And part of the job that we have is, as a researchers, is separating fraud, actual legitimate fraud, from what we call negative financial experiences. And so what we have here is a pretty clean cut. The people who were victimized truly were victimized by financial fraud. Okay. So that's so essentially what we do now is we said, okay, what separates these three groups? What separates the people who did not engage from the people who engaged and did not become victimized, and the people who ultimately became victims? And we'll take a look at some of the variables that floated to the top or were most predictive of engagement and victimization now. So financial insecurity, I say, you know, this kind of conventional wisdom that, you know, if you need money or if you're financially insecure, you're more likely to perhaps become victimized by fraud. Maybe it's because you're willing to take more risks in terms of offers that you're given. And but we don't know that because, you know, with survey research, there's always questions you wished you asked and you didn't. And one of the questions that we wish we asked was about risk tolerance. Kind of, are you willing to take more risk when it comes to investments or other types of offers? And we didn't ask that, but we suspect that well, we did find that financial insecurity was associated with victimization, and we suspect that part of that could be driven by need and associated with that, a willingness to take more investment risk or even just risk in general because you need more money. So you could see the data points here. So this is comparing victims to non-victims. And so we said, do you spend more than your monthly income? And this is a somewhat small gap here. 23% of victims said they spent more than their monthly income compared to 17% of non-victims. So it's a 6 percentage point difference. It's not overwhelming, but pretty big. Financially fragile is an interesting one. So we we have a question that measures financial fragility. And you could see it somewhat kind of noted by, next to the asterisk below. We say, hey, in the event of an emergency, could you come up with $2,000 in 30 days to deal with this emergency? Now, we don't ask how they would get it. Like, in other words, we just say, can you come up with $2,000? So in theory, they could ask a family member. They could take out a loan. They could put it on their credit card. We're not interested in that. We're just interested in, could you come up with $2,000 in 30 days to cover an emergency? And we see a really big difference here. The victims are much more financially fragile than the non-victims, 38% for victims compared to 20% for non-victims. So, you know, victims are almost twice as likely to say that they are financially fragile than non-victims. So that's a pretty large effect. The last line at debt. So yeah, for a number of researchers have hypothesized that debt could drive likelihood to engage with some type of fraudulent activity, and we do see evidence for that. 39% of victims said they have too much debt compared to 28% of non-victims. So so that was a pretty it's a pretty meaningful difference. Also, you'll see quotes throughout the quotes throughout the slides, and this one was, I was overwhelmed with debt. So essentially, when we were surveying these people, occasionally we asked for their comments on the questions. So these are some of the comments that, so these come from the survey, and they also come from the interviews we did, but they're actual quotes from people that we spoke with for this study. Okay. So another factor that was associated with victimization was financial literacy. So I'll take a step back here and say how we the question is, how do we measure financial literacy? We measure it with a 5-item financial literacy quiz that is actually pretty straightforward. You can find the financial literacy quiz at usfinancialcapability.org if you like. So it's usfinancialcapability.org. And so there's a number of ways to measure financial literacy. This is one, and it's probably the most widely used financial literacy quiz. So basically, there are 5 questions. So the highest score, so you get a point for answering a question correctly, and you get no point if it's wrong, and you can also say don't know to the answer, and you get no point if you say don't know. So the highest score you can get is 5. The lowest is a 0. And you can see the 3 segments here. On the left, you could see the people who did not engage. On average, they can answer 3.3 of these 5 questions correctly. We see a nice linear relationship here. So the people who engaged but did not lose money could answer 3 questions correctly, and the people who engaged and lost money could only answer 2.7 questions correctly. Now, so these are averages, and I know they don't look particularly like these are large differences, but you have to remember 2 things. Well, first, these are statistically significant differences, and also these are means. So and they're on essentially a 6-point scale because 0 counts. 0 to 5 would be 6 values. So that, going from 2.7 for the group on the right, the engaged and lost money, to 3.3, that's actually a 10% increase in financial literacy. So what we're seeing here is that as financial literacy increases, the likelihood of being victimized decreases, and the size of the effect is anywhere from 5 to 10%. In other words, people who are not victimized have 5 to 10% higher financial literacy levels. Now, there is a caveat here, and that's so other research studies have found that, well, some research studies have found that specific types of fraud are related to financial literacy, but in the opposite direction. I'm specifically talking about investment fraud. So there's some research that finds that as your financial literacy goes up, so does the likelihood that you become victimized by financial fraud. In other words, high levels of financial literacy is associated with a greater likelihood of victimization if the fraud is investment fraud. And we think what's going on there is that people who have high levels of financial literacy may be overconfident and more willing to engage in some type of fraudulent investment type scam because they're overconfident. They think they know more than they do. So I will say we did not have many investment fraud victims in our study. I think we only had 23. So the majority of the people we looked at in this particular study were not investment fraud, which is why I think we find kind of as financial literacy goes up, victimization rates go down. So it is a bit of a nuanced finding, but nonetheless an important one. Okay. So the last factor I'll talk about that was associated with victimization is what we'll call social isolation. And so basically we said that there are different types of social isolation. In some instances, people might not have anybody to talk to. They may be an older person who lives alone, they get a phone call, and they simply don't have anybody around to talk to. But then there are people who have people around but chose not to discuss the solicitation with anybody. So in either case, whether it's you don't have anybody to talk to or you chose not to discuss it with anybody, in either case you're socially isolated. And this is exactly what the fraudsters want to do. They want to isolate you. So what we found is if you did not talk to anybody, you were significantly more likely to be victimized by fraud, by the fraudulent activity you were targeted for. It's interesting, when we were doing the surveys with people, and one particular interviewee comes to mind. She was a victim of investment fraud, actually, and the interviewer said, well, why didn't you talk to anybody about it? And she said, well, I had people to talk to, but I did not want anybody to talk me out of it. So she kind of knew that that if she talked to somebody, she might not be able to participate in this particular investment, and she actively chose not to talk to anybody. But more common is that the people may not have someone to discuss it with. The other point I'll make on this slide is that we also had what's called a social isolation scale, which really measures loneliness, right? So it was kind of a 3-question scale. It measured loneliness. And again, we found a positive correlation between loneliness and victimization. So the higher your scales on this loneliness, the higher your scores on this loneliness scale, the more likely you were to become victimized by fraud. So again, kind of ties into the whole social isolation issue. And one other point related to social isolation, we also found that single people, divorced people, and separated people were more likely to be victimized by fraud, and we think that again ties into social isolation. You know, talking to somebody about the fraud, when you talk to somebody or multiple people about the fraud, whether it's your sister or your parents or your friend, you're basically harnessing the collective knowledge of a lot more people. So you might not have heard about this fraud, but perhaps somebody you talked to did. So that's in part the value of engaging other people when you have these types of offers. Okay. So let's talk about engagement and why people chose to engage. I'm just doing a time check. We're okay on time. So we asked, why did you engage? And so we can only ask the people who engaged. So the people who engaged fell into two groups, as we know, the people who became victims and the people who did not become victims. So on the left there, you see the top responses for people who became victimized. The first was that, hey, the person I spoke with seemed official. Second one was, I was under time pressure. I thought the person was nice. I worried about missing out on an opportunity. So non-victims were much less likely to agree with these statements. Now, what's interesting about this is the FINRA Foundation has been doing education on financial fraud and how to identify the red flags of fraud, how to avoid fraud, and these these top reasons align pretty much with our educational initiatives. For example, we talk about source credibility, which means like you basically fake your credibility, and that's reflected in they seemed official. You see that a lot in the IRS scams, and the person says they're a government official. But always check, credibility can be faked, so you should always check the background of it. The second one is this notion of scarcity. So fraudsters often say, hey, you only have a limited time to decide, or you know what, we're only letting 100 people into this investment, so you have to respond now. That's scarcity. You actually see that in all these things you see in kind of legitimate marketing activities as well, particularly time pressure. If you ever watch QVC, they have the little clock counting down. So yeah, so scarcity. I thought the person was nice. That was interesting. It kind of aligns a little bit with one of the things we teach people, which is reciprocity, that fraudsters will often give you something, whether it's a free lunch or kind of a discount on some type of product or service, so that you feel obligated to reciprocate. So that might fall into the I thought the person was nice kind of category. I worried about missing out on an opportunity aligns with what we call phantom riches. So fraudsters dangle the opportunity of wealth or a great deal before you, and it's just that, it's a phantom. But it can create this idea that, hey, I could be missing out on an opportunity, or as my kids like to say, FOMO, fear of missing out. I don't really use that phrase, but I'm throwing it in here. In any event, these are the top reasons why people said they engaged with the fraudster. So I want to shift gears a little and talk about what we call the role of structural interventions. This is kind of a new concept, and for this paper, we actually coined the term structural interventions. So when you think of a structural intervention, think of the person, the bank teller who says, well, are you sure you want to send this money to Nigeria? Or the CVS employee who says, there are scams going around where people they're asking people to put a lot of money on the Apple cards, and you sure you want to do this? Or even it's someone in a Western Union office that says, are you sure you want to kind of transfer this money to this particular person? So that's the kind of a structural intervention. So, if you think of the full sample, we had 1,408. So of the people who engaged, 53% engaged, 20% of the people who engaged said, hey, you know what, somebody intervened, or some organization intervened to try to stop me from moving forward. So we thought this was great, first of all, that, wow, 20% of the people who engaged, there was some type of intervention. And then we also saw that half of the people who noted an intervention did not become victims, which we thought was promising. But again, we said, hey, half still became victims. So what we're trying to figure out is kind of, how can we improve the interventions, the structural interventions, if you will, so that the not victimized percent goes up and the victimized percent goes down. And again, I'll refer to one of the interviews we did. This was a young woman who was a victim of the IRS scam, and the scammer had her on the phone, had her drive to CVS to put, and she was going to put money on the Apple cards for the scammer. And that's where I gave that example. The CVS employee said, there's a common fraud that uses this technique. Are you sure you want to do this? And the scammer was on the phone with her at that point. She had the phone up to her ear, and the scammer basically could hear everything and was kind of talking her through it. But so somebody intervened, and that was an example where somebody intervened, and she said, no, I want to go through with it. So that perhaps there are ways we can make these structural interventions more effective. With this study, we also realized we had a really good opportunity to kind of ask both victims and non-victims how they perceive victims. And I think many of you probably know that the reporting rate for financial fraud is pretty low. There are a number of possible reasons for it. Some people don't report because they're embarrassed. Some people don't report because they simply think reporting won't really help them get their money back. But in terms, so it kind of raises the question: how are victims perceived? Do people have the right? Do victims really, when they're embarrassed, does it somewhat make sense that they're embarrassed because people perceive them in a negative light? So we asked 3 questions related to this. We asked, do victims of financial fraud lack common sense? And then we asked if they blame the victim when someone's victimized by fraud. And then we asked, do you think victims are gullible? And you can see the 3 segments there. So on the left are those who did not engage at all. In the middle is engaged and not victimized, and on the right is victimized. Now, so when you look at the lack common sense variable, clearly a strong relationship there. So people who did not engage are much more likely to think that victims lack common sense. But among victims, 13% is kind of low. So a little over 1 in 10 victims admit that, well, I shouldn't say admit, perceive that victims lack common sense. So I thought that was somewhat promising. What I think wasn't promising was the blame the victim. When we asked, do you blame the victim for losing money? There were no differences here, well, essentially no differences between the 3 segments, but almost a third of victims, people who were victimized, almost a third of those people blamed the victim. So, and this actually resonates with some other research we did on the psychological and emotional effects of financial fraud, what we call non-traditional costs of fraud. What we found is that, victims of fraud are much more likely to experience stress, anxiety, insomnia, depression, lower feelings of self-worth. So there's this aligns with that. Victims are blaming, well, at least almost a third of victims are blaming themselves, and that probably has some likely psychological and emotional repercussions. And then gullible, are victims gullible? Again, you see that linear relationship here, but these differences aren't too large. But still, you see over a third of victims say, yeah, victims are gullible. Doesn't go up that much higher for the people who didn't engage and the people who engaged and were not victimized. But still, anywhere between a third and and probably less than a half of people believe that fraud victims are gullible. So again, the takeaway here, I think, is to blame the victim one, because I think that has a lot of implications for whether people report the crime and how they handle the crime. By the way, if they blame themselves, they may be less likely to seek out help, whether it be kind of financial help, psychological, or emotional help. So this is that's an implication of this finding as well. So preventing financial fraud. So yeah, so part of the study was kind of, okay, so we had people who were targeted and were able to avoid being victimized, either by not engaging or by somewhere along the line saying, yeah, something isn't right about this. And so we asked them kind of, why? How did you not become a victim? And the number one thing was knowing about the methods of scammers in general. So knowing some of those things that we talked about a couple minutes ago, that source credibility and phantom riches and reciprocity, knowing that those are the techniques, scarcity, knowing that those are the techniques that fraudsters use, help the people who were not victimized, help them not become victimized, should I say. So then we asked this question, well, we found that the second most cited reason was having experience with scams. So this was one of the researchers, after the fact, there are some questions that you should have asked, like I mentioned earlier. There are also some questions that are worded poorly, or some questions you probably should have elaborated on. Here's one. So the first time I was presenting this research, I said, well, having experience with scams was the second most cited reasons for how to avoid them. And, an astute audience member said, well, what does having experience with scams mean? And I have to be honest with you, I don't know, because that is exactly the way we word the questions. We just said, you have experience with scams. So we should have been much more specific, but I still wanted to point out that experience in some fashion, but I can't articulate what that experience is, helps people avoid scams. The third one there, so knowing about the specific scam you were targeted for. This sharply reduced engagement and victimization. So that if you were targeted for the IRS scam and you had heard about that, you're 80% less likely to engage and 40% less likely to be a victim. Or other types of scams as well, whether it's the grandparent scam or the charity scams, et cetera. If you know about the scam, you're less likely to be victimized by it. And again, this comes back to social isolation, right? If you could ask somebody, hey, have you heard it? I got this offer today. Have you heard about it? If they can tell you about the scam in some fashion, that's going to help. That's going to help prevent you from engaging and becoming victimized. So we clearly, knowledge is power, and we found a lot of evidence that knowledge is really, really helpful when it comes to reducing the likelihood of engaging and becoming victimized by fraud. So trust your gut. This is an interesting one, and it's one the research team debated quite a bit. So we did find that among those who engaged but were not victimized, by far the most common reason they cited for not being victimized. So again, these are people who engaged and were not victimized. We said, well, you engaged? What stopped you? The number one reason was something was not right about the situation. By far, it was the number one reason. And well, we can't. Our first knee-jerk reaction was, this is great. We could tell people to trust your gut, but it's really kind of more complicated than that, because, as one of the researchers on the research team said, well, what if their gut is telling them today is their lucky day? That's a problem with trusting your gut. So we basically our advice here is, if your gut's leading you away from some type of offer, yeah, trust it. If it's leading you toward some type of offer, then you should certainly do more research, check the background, and talk to people before moving forward. So, yeah, trusting your gut is it could be a good thing, but again, it could work against you as well. So, so something to be careful about. I think this might be actually two more slides, but so. Both, the Better Business Bureau and the FINRA Foundation in particular, we're really interested in, part of what we do is we try to educate people about scams. And what we want to know is what's the most effective way to educate people about scams. So we said, think about what you know about financial fraud and scams, and where did you learn about it? And again, far and away, the number one source is news stories. Now, we didn't ask, did your news come from from a social media site, a print newspaper, a TV? We just, and again, we'd like to, if we could have that question back, we'd probably refine it. But point being that the news is a great source for educating people about fraud, because that's where they're saying they're getting it from. So go to where they are. Word of mouth was well, not again, but word of mouth was highly cited too, which is kind of interesting, because we also, I'm not showing the data here because there's only so much data you can show, but we also asked people, what do you think would be an effective source and of learning about frauds, and word of mouth was really low. People said word of mouth is not a good way to learn about frauds, but as you can see, it's the second most cited source. So we thought that was interesting, and I'll jump down to the last two there. In-person meeting seminars and educational brochures. Now this kind of, as people who provide in-person seminars to help this one actually, to help deter, reduce fraud victimization and also produce educational brochures, we kind of said, wow, that doesn't seem to be a really effective channel. But I think that there's a more nuanced story here, which is that by design, in-person meetings, seminars, and educational brochures can only reach a fairly small group of people. What we hope is that they're the influencers, and that in-person meetings, seminars, and educational brochures feed into word of mouth and can really kind of help reduce fraud by basically educating people who could then spread the word. So the takeaway for us wasn't meetings and brochures aren't important, but there's that maybe there are ways that we could increase the likelihood that people who have brochures and have attended seminars will spread the information that they learn by word of mouth. So just to wrap up here, and then I think we'll open it up for some questions. Perceiving the scammer as an authority is a problem. Definitely check the credibility. Check the background of the person to make sure that their credibility is authentic. Is something you should do. I talked about the factors related to victimization. There are others. Interestingly, I'll back up to that. Financial insecurity, financial literacy, and social isolation rose to the top. What's not here, interestingly, is demographic factors. We really didn't find demographic factors separating victims from non-victims. There's a slight effect for age, but for the most part, it was what we call these psychographic variables that really separated the victims from the non-victims, and not the demographic variables. Structural interventions appear to help. I think that's a big takeaway, that there's an opportunity here to, one, increase essentially the availability of structural interventions, and maybe even improve their effectiveness, because they're there right now and they are helping, but maybe we could enhance that. I just talked about trust your gut, but trust it if it's moving you away. If it's moving you toward an offer, you take a step back, talk to people, do some background research. Actually, I got two ones coming out here. Knowledge is power. Again, knowing about frauds, knowing about the way of scammers can help reduce victimization. And last, the media has a role to play here. And to that end, we actually got fairly good media coverage on this particular research study. It was carried in the Wall Street Journal, CBS News, TV carried it, other smaller media outlets carried it as well. So that's something we've always pushed, trying to get the research out through media channels, but it's something we'll even focus on more moving forward now that we have this data. I think that's about my time, and with that, I'll pass it back. I'll pass it back. I think it's Laura who's moderating. So, Laura, is that you? Okay.
Yes, that's me. Thank you so much, Gary. We really appreciate you sharing this this new research. It's definitely really interesting and insightful, and hopefully helps us try to figure out how to help victims better. Do you have a couple questions? And just as a reminder, if you do have a question, there's a Q&A box at the bottom toward the middle of your screen. You can go ahead and type your questions there. I'll read them out to Gary and let him verbally answer them. So the first one was that you cited a website for a financial literacy quiz. Which website was that?
Yeah, I should have put it on the slide. It's usfinancialcapability.org. But quite frankly, if you just put into Google FINRA, F-I-N-R-A, and financial capability, I'm pretty sure it's the first website that comes up. But the actual URL, did I say that? It's usfinancialcapability.org. I hope I didn't say .com. So, and you'll see there's the tab that says Test Yourself, and you could take this financial literacy quiz. You could also take an investor literacy quiz if you're interested. That's a 10-question quiz. So by all means, play around with that. And also, that site has a lot of a lot of good information on financial capability in general. Not so much financial fraud, which you'd go to saveandinvest.org, which is our site that has fraud-related information. But yeah, usfinancialcapability.org.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question. There was a bit of confusion about whether higher financial literacy leads to higher victimization or lower victimization. Could you go into that explanation just once again about whether your lower financial literacy leads to higher victimization as correlation versus causation, and then like any exceptions? I know you mentioned financial fraud or investment.
Yeah. Okay. So for this study, we found that higher financial literacy is associated with lower victimization rates. So the higher financial literacy, the less likely you are to become a victim of fraud. Now, I will say I was choosing my words carefully there because we don't know that financial literacy leads to we don't know that financial literacy causes you to be less likely victimized by fraud. We do know that they're associated, but since this was a cross-sectional research, it's hard to, we can't really imply causality, but we do know that high levels of financial literacy are associated with lower levels of victimization. Now, I did muddy the waters when I brought up investment fraud. So one specific type of fraud is investment fraud. And other researchers, well, me and other researchers, have found that it's the opposite for investment fraud. So as financial literacy increases, the likelihood of being victimized by investment fraud also increases for that one specific type of fraud, investment fraud. And we think what's happening there is that the higher levels of financial literacy kind of bring on feelings of overconfidence. It essentially makes you overconfident, and when you're overconfident, you're more likely to kind of not evaluate the investment, in detail, and maybe make some decisions that you wouldn't make. So, so that the takeaway here is these relationships are not causal. More researchers need to establish that, but for this study, high financial literacy leads to low victimization, or is associated with low victimization, and for one specific type of fraud, investment fraud, higher levels of financial literacy are associated with higher levels of victimization. So I hope that that's clearer, but if not, just let me know.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I think that's good to clarify. Next question. Did your research show that financially fragile people were more likely to be a victim where scammers say they are winning money versus if scammers say they owe money?
We didn't distinguish, actually, I want to make sure I get the wording correct. Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, did the research indicate whether financially fragile people were more likely to be victims if scammers said they were winning money versus if the scammer said that they owed money?
Wow, that's an interesting question. It's funny, they teach you when you had like presentation class, not to say that's an interesting question, but that is an interesting question.
It is.
Because I say it's interesting because we haven't thought about that at all. Now, some scams, like employment scams, clearly have to do with earning money, whereas sweepstakes scams have to do with winning money. I think this is a really interesting distinction, and we haven't looked at it yet, to be honest with you. The one thing I'll add, which is somewhat related, is we were able to distinguish between fear and excitement. In other words, we did find that for some types of scams, excitement was the driving factor, the motivating factor, if you will. So again, sweepstakes scams would fall into that category, where the person was excited in investment scams, the person was excited to kind of get money. But the other scams, like the IRS scam, they were, and the tech support scam, they were more driven by fear. They were trying to instill fear in the person. So we have looked at the fear versus excitement, but we haven't looked at winning versus earning. But I'm making a note right now that that's something we could take a deeper dive on.
Yeah, I would be curious about that as well. I don't know about any research that goes into that. whether it's the fear or the excitement that's a bigger driver. That's a good question. The next question is, did you correlate risk factors with the amount of money that was lost?
Yes. Actually, to back up, we didn't correlate risk factors with that. We took a look at scam type, and some scams, like investment scam, you had really high losses, whereas other scams, like say online purchase scams and things like that, you had lower dollar value losses. Interesting, though, that another interesting question in the sense that we did not correlate those three risk factors that I told you about, social isolation, financial insecurity, and financial literacy, with the amount of money lost. One of the challenges we have is with this research, but with very specific questions about the research, like how much money did you lose, is for some of these people that the fraud took place, 2 to 3 years before we were asking them. So we have something called, there's something in survey research called memory decay, where the answers get less accurate as time goes on. So we didn't put that much stock in how much money they said they lost, but I do think it's worth looking to see whether the amount lost is associated with risk factors. I think that's a great suggestion.
Next question is, why would somebody report scams to the Better Business Bureau instead of the FTC? And I'm happy to give my 2 cents here, if you don't mind, Gary. We
Sure.
always, when we're doing presentations about responding to financial fraud, we always tell people to report as widely as possible. I know the Better Business Bureau works with law enforcement to try to figure out where to coordinate efforts in investigations. So I think the more you report, the more places you report, the more likely that something is going to be done about this. Maybe not your individual scam, but maybe that type of scam, particularly if there's a lot of it going on in a certain area and people are losing, lots of people are falling victim to it. So we always suggest report widely if possible. We know that it can be a big ask because reporting can be a bit tedious, but the more we can report, the more information and data out there, the better we will be in trying to prevent this stuff from continuing to happen.
Yeah, and I'll just add a couple points to that. One is that we have done surveys where we said where did you report or where do you think you should report, and Better Business Bureau is always and usually significantly higher than the FTC. Better Business Bureau is first, FTC is second, but people think of the Better Business Bureau first, perhaps because they're out there more and maybe they advertise more. I will say, though, that the Scam Tracker database feeds the FTC's database. So the Scam Tracker, Better Business Bureau sends a data feed over, I think, on a daily basis with the frauds report to Scam Tracker. So it does eventually end up in the same source. One of the things we wrestled in early versions of the paper that I'm discussing, we actually had a section on kind of reporting, where you should report to. But the research team couldn't agree on where to tell people to go. I mean, yes, it's the FTC, this is Better Business Bureau, but depending on the type of fraud, you might want to go to the SEC, you might want to go to FINRA, you might want to go to the police department. The point being that it's complicated. I don't think there's just one answer to where you go, and I think that's unfortunate because I think the lack of clarity with where you should report drives down reporting rates.
Thanks for that. We don't have any new questions, but there was a little bit of chatter in the Q&A about some types of scams where one of them was people calling into senior housing from, supposedly from fire departments, police departments, raising money for some sort of charity. Another about a potential romance scam. And I just want to make sure we address that and let you guys know that be very, very, very wary of mass marketing scams, people calling, raising money, particularly when they're targeting senior housing communities or places where older adults may reside, because we know older adults tend to be targeted more for a variety of reasons. I don't know, there's not always a whole lot you can do to stop those types of calls. You can put people on do not call lists and things of that nature, but it won't necessarily stop all of those types of solicitations. But yes, as much as we can inform older adults about these scams and try to make sure that they're aware that these scams are out there and that people are targeting them more than they might be targeting other populations, the better we may be to prevent those sorts of things.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add is that I think that's where the scam tracker database can come in handy. It's a good, because you could do it by geographic region. If you live in a retirement community, you could put in the zip code of the retirement community and see what scams are being reported there. The other thing I'll mention is there are some technological solutions. For example, there's a company called NomoRobo, NomoRobo, that basically it's pretty easy to prevent robocalls from coming to your cell phone or your landline phone. So, and there's other companies that do this, not just NomoRobo. I just happen to know them. So yeah, there are ways to prevent those calls, and you could research it. But yeah, you got to, like Laura said, you got to be really careful when you get those types of calls.
All right, and one more question did come in. Any suggestions on how to persuade victims that they are being scammed? I know this is a tough one that we've encountered before when somebody just it happens, I think, a lot in romance scams where somebody just can't believe that this person that they think that they know that they've been talking to for sometimes a really long period of time is actually defrauding them. And even given all the facts, it can be hard to convince them otherwise, other than, kind of giving them the facts and informing them about fraud and how perpetrators perpetrate fraud by grooming victims and establishing relationships. There's no easy way to persuade people that I'm aware of. And Gary, please let us know if you have any other ideas there.
I agree with you. That's a tough one. I haven't seen any data on it. Anecdotally, you hear stories about people having to actually bring in a police officer to explain to the mother that this is not a real person that she's sending money to. There is this illusion of invulnerability. Not just for romance scams, but people don't believe they can be victimized by fraud, so they kind of shut down. They're not open to educational initiatives, whether they be formal or informal from family members. So this is a really, really tough one, and I wish I had a better answer for you. But like Laura, I don't think that there's not much on this topic yet, like Laura said.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I hope someday that there is some way we can figure out to let people know, to help them when they've been totally fooled by a scammer, but it can be really hard when you find yourself in that position. But thank you all for your really insightful questions. Thank you, Gary, for this great information. I learned a lot and hope all of you did as well. Appreciate you joining. We will be sending out a link to the recording later this week and a survey. And I hope everybody has a great day. Thanks again.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.